So we should now begin to get participants rolling in. Yep, they're coming in now, thick and fast. Good morning to everyone. We'll just wait a few minutes or a minute or two, whilst attendees pick up. Andrew, are you going to do what you normally do, is to give a bit of an introduction? Great, thanks very much.
Yeah.
We're climbing fast now. We're up to 40, 44.
We're expecting about 90, aren't we?
Yeah, I think once we get to 60, we could probably start, I think.
Okay.
I mean, people won't be missing any of the actual presentation. They'll just be missing the opening words, I think.
Yes, of course. Yeah. Where are we now?
40, 49, 50 with us?
We kick in, I think?
Yeah, I think we get going.
I think we should. So
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest in our series of webinars. Before Easter, which seems a long time ago now, Constructing Excellence Southwest, Constructing Excellence Midlands and the Structural Timber Association started on a series of webinars, which post-Easter we've joined forces with Constructing Excellence Wales, Constructing Excellence in the North East, and also the Housing Forum, to bring you a webinar every Tuesday and Friday at midday. Initially, we were dealing with COVID-19 topics, but in recent weeks, we've broadened the subject matter. And today, I'm delighted to say that we are going to be talking about probably the biggest issue on the planet. And this is that of the climate crisis. And I'm very pleased to say that today we have Maria Dunn with us from Birmingham City Council, who's going to give her views on how Birmingham City Council are looking to achieve their net zero target of 2030. Before I introduce, or before we introduce Maria, I would like to place on record my thanks not only to Maria, but also to Howard and John from Leaders Meets, who regularly host these webinars for us. And just before we ask Maria to say a few words and lead us on this very important discussion, I'm going to ask Howard if he would please just give the usual house rules. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. In terms of what you have on your screens, at the moment you will see the Birmingham client's emergency. Maria has no camera availability, so important that we use the questions and answer menu that you'll find there, and Maria certainly afterwards will take questions. There is also the ability of a chat pane. You'll find that, so if you want to speak with me, anyone else, or even Maria, please use the chat pane, but try and keep the questions and answers into the Q&A menu. If anyone would like to say anything when we get to questions and come on screen, I will ask people to raise their hands and I can bring them live, because what we hope is we'll get a lively discussion going on this topic. So I'm going to hand back to Andrew, and please use those menus. Many thanks.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Howard. Within Constructing Excellence Midlands, we have a very active group that deals with innovation and sustainability. And its chair, Noel Street of 3D Read, was very keen that we should hear about what Birmingham City Council are looking to do in terms of achieving their net zero target of 2030. So I was delighted when Maria accepted our invitation to come and speak to us today. Birmingham City obviously is the second city in the UK. So whatever Birmingham does, others are going to follow. So we await with bated breath to hear what you have to say, and I hope it will lead to a very lively debate and discussion, and we can all take away issues that we can take back into our own businesses. Without further ado, Maria, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Maria Dunn, Head of Development Policy at Birmingham City Council. I've only been with the organisation since January, but it's been a busy few months. And one of the projects that I've picked up is the Route to Zero work, which is our response to the climate emergency. In terms of today's presentation, going to have a look at declaring the climate emergency and the background, the task force which was set up to respond to the climate emergency, the progress that's been made to date, the next steps, the key challenges, and then some concluding remarks. And then it's a fairly short presentation, and then there's plenty of opportunity for questions and discussion. So, Birmingham declared a climate emergency on the 11th of June 2019, and the City Council set out the ambition for the city as a whole, not just the City Council, to be carbon neutral by 2030 or as soon as possible thereafter as a just transition permits. And I think that's a very important point. The just transition is something that our politicians are particularly keen on, making sure that any measures to achieve net zero carbon by 2030 don't put undue pressure on our less affluent communities. So the declaration included a commitment to set up a climate emergency task force, and we'll have a look at the work of the task force shortly. The 25th of June 2019, Cabinet also agreed that the council's plan would include a new priority, which states that Birmingham will be a city that takes a leading role in climate change. So that commitment essentially embeds the Route to Zero work across the council. So the task force then, the Climate Change Emergency Task Force was set up in autumn 2019 to support the net zero ambition. And it brings together key partners and stakeholders from across the city and provides a voice for the city. So it's cross-party politically and it's multi-agency, so it's much broader than just the council. And there are Youth Strike for Climate representatives, faith community representatives, community representatives. So there's a wide background of people on that task force. It's chaired by Councillor Zafar, our Cabinet Member for Transport and Environment. And the task force is informing the development of a shared action plan for how Birmingham can respond to the climate emergency. So ultimately, we will put recommendations to the City Council, but that work is informed by the task force. So in terms of the progress then, the task force was set up. There's been 4 meetings of the task force. We were disrupted slightly by COVID-19, as I'm sure you'll all understand. So we haven't met as frequently recently, and also the most recent meeting and certainly the next 2 will be online rather than in person. So that has hindered to some extent the work that we can do, but we are very much committed to continuing to take the work forward. So a number of engagement workshops have been held, and they focused on specific topics to help us understand what is needed to achieve net zero carbon and what the barriers and challenges are. The workshops have included specialists in topic areas from within and outside the city, and the main themes for these workshops have been housing, transport, planning, and then there's 2 more that are due to happen. One specifically looking at East Birmingham and North Solihull, which is a specific focus for regeneration for the city, and one specifically looking at community engagement. So these workshops will all help to inform the action planning process. So in terms of the housing workshop, that looked very much at the barriers and opportunities around retrofit, what we'd need in terms of funding, regulation changes to try and get to a position where we can retrofit housing to net zero. Transport looked at how people will move around, moving to transport that's low emissions, pushing people towards public transport, and that links into the Birmingham Transport Plan, which we'll come on to. The planning workshop looked at what planning policy particularly can do, and how we would need to change planning policy in order to deliver net zero development. So it was split really into a discussion around our existing planning policies and whether the implementation could be more effective, and what we would do in the future and what the barriers are preventing us doing that. So one of the key issues that came out of the planning workshop was the government's future home standard, and how what the government decide to do with the future home standard impacts on what we can do locally. So we've also had a programme of community engagement, a series of focused workshops which targeted specific groups of residents in order to be representative, and an online survey that's being carried out on social media. And this explored people's thoughts on climate change and their role within it. And it also helped us to understand that the messages that are likely to resonate and how they should be delivered for best success, and to understand how to better engage audiences in further work. In terms of the key findings, awareness of climate change is high in the city, although we do think it might have been a little bit skewed because the online survey, the awareness was very high, so we think it might have been an element of people already aware of climate change responding to the survey. But generally we think awareness of climate change issues in the city is high. Residents don't view climate change necessarily as something that directly impacts on them, even though we do have evidence locally of events that are related to climate change, for example, like extreme weather, the extreme heat of 2018. But I think in terms of people's understanding of climate change, they don't necessarily link it together. Many residents already make good choices, but they tend to be financially rather than environmentally driven. And the problem feels too big for individuals to make a difference, although there is a degree of recognition that everybody needs to do something. So in terms of the evidence base to help us decide how to move forward, we've commissioned a study to look at carbon reduction options. So this study has been undertaken by Anthesis, and it should be going out to the task force soon, so it should become available, to establish the baseline carbon emissions for the city, including the City Council's own emissions and scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions for the city as a whole. Setting out carbon budgets and emissions pathways for the city, and providing a sectoral analysis with carbon reduction recommendations for each of the following sectors. So council behaviour change, obviously very important. City Council need to embed net zero into everything they do in order to get there by 2030, and in order to set an example across the city. Council strategy and engagement. So again, looking at the council's own behaviour and how we can move forward and shape and influence the rest of the city. Transport, so recommendations around how we can further increase our efforts to move to net zero modes of transport. Buildings, so that's again about how we ensure that we are constructing to the highest standards that we can, and retrofitting. And then energy supply, so how we decarbonise the energy supply, looking at natural capital, how we dispose of our waste, and industry within the area. So, in terms of what we're already doing, Birmingham City Council is not new to tackling carbon emissions. 2013, there was a target to reduce emissions by 60% by 2027. And the most recent update shows that by 2017, there was a 38.6% reduction against 1990 levels. So a considerable amount of work has already been done in terms of reducing carbon emissions against 1990 levels. One of the key projects is the Birmingham Transport Plan, and that's due to be adopted in 2020. So this went out to consultation last year, and it will set out a series of pledges as to how the council and others in the city can support journeys towards cleaner air. And as part of this, there are 4 big moves. So we're looking to reallocate road space, transform the city centre, prioritise active travel in local neighbourhoods, and manage demand through parking measures. So we have obviously had COVID-19, and as a result of that, we've got the Birmingham Emergency Transport Plan. So this is an additional piece of work which looks to bring forward some of the projects in the original transport plan more quickly, and also looks to respond to supporting walking, cycling and public transport in the context of COVID-19. So again, that's shaped around the same 4 big moves, and some of the projects under reallocating road space will support the creation of safe space for walking and cycling and social distancing, whilst maintaining public transport provision. In terms of transforming the city centre, again, that's about walking and cycling routes, and doing that alongside public transport services and limiting access for the private car. And the big aspiration in the main transport plan was around dividing the city up into cells, similar to a model that was employed in Ghent, and looking to restrict journeys around the city centre, but rather have a city centre where you can enter and exit particular cells in a vehicle, but you can't move between the cells, and that will facilitate a much better walking and cycling environment. Prioritising active travel in local neighbourhoods. So we have to remember that the city is about much more than the city centre. We've got lots of local neighbourhoods. In terms of the more recent challenges around COVID-19, creating extra space for social distancing and allowing people the space and the ability to feel safe walking and cycling in areas where we've seen significantly increased footfall, as people tend to be staying at home more and shopping and enjoying recreational opportunities more locally. And then managing demand through parking measures. So where land and space is currently occupied by car parking, looking at opportunities for repurposing that for walking, cycling and social distancing in the short term, and looking at post-COVID, reallocating that space for walking and cycling. So in terms of the COVID-19 response and the emergency transport plan, which has accelerated some of the transport work, we've had schemes implemented in Kingsheath, Erdington and on Ladypool Road, which have created more space for social distancing and pedestrians, and we're looking at bringing further schemes forward as well. So we also have the Naturally Birmingham project, and this is seeking to enhance the city's parks and green spaces, whilst also focusing on children, housing, health and wellbeing and jobs and skills. And this is essentially about increasing the use of our open spaces and looking at the multiple functions that they provide. Obviously, in the light of COVID-19, we've seen increased reliance on local green space for recreation, and those spaces being more extensively used, which is really good to see. We also have the Birmingham District Energy Scheme, which is the largest low carbon heating network in Birmingham. The network is owned and operated by ENGIE, and it's a partnership with the City Council, Aston University and the Children's Hospital, and it supplies low carbon, low cost energy to major energy consumers across the city, so that's quite a significant scheme. Then we also have Birmingham Municipal Housing Trust, so the council delivers its own social housing. The trust delivers affordable housing, and the current specification includes energy and water saving measures, but at the moment the trust are exploring options for using more sustainable construction methods and possibly looking at exemplar projects to take that forward. So we've touched on the impact of COVID-19, but it's certainly changed the way the city operates. And the key impacts have been on transport, energy demand, waste and natural capital. So again, the walking and cycling emphasis. Energy demand has very much moved to increasing energy demands and water demands in the home as people are at home more. Obviously, city centre has been very quiet, so offices, retail, not using so much energy. Changing waste, households generating more waste because they're at home more. And natural capital, again, that comes back to the increased use of local green space. And I think it's fair to say that with all of the trends, we don't know how much of it will continue beyond COVID-19, but I think what we can be sure of is that we won't just go back to how we were before. And I think some of that will have positive implications for carbon emissions, but some of it could potentially be negative. For example, at the moment, the message is not to use public transport unless you really have to. Obviously, post-COVID, we don't want to undo all of the good work that we've done in terms of modal shift, and we want to ensure that we have a public transport network that's fit for purpose and that people feel safe using. And I think it's increased the emphasis on equality, inclusivity and rebuilding a greener economy. So I think that public awareness and businesses are focused on that green recovery. And I think there is much more government emphasis on the green economy. So in terms of the next steps for Birmingham, the anthesis report, the feedback from engagement workshops and the input from the working groups and the task force will inform the preparation of a report that's going to September Council, which will set out recommendations for achieving net zero carbon across the city. Those recommendations are likely to be a mix of changes that can be made now within the resources we have available, and longer term changes that require external funding sources and policy changes. And there will be an element of lobbying government and identifying what our key asks are in order to deliver the climate change programme. And then following on from September Council, we obviously need to move into action planning and implementation. And I think that'll be a really interesting and challenging time for the city, and a real opportunity for the partners on the task force to look at making real changes on the ground. So now is an opportunity for questions and discussion, really. Happy to take questions. I'm not sure that I can see people's hands going up, so I might need someone to just manage the questions.
Okay, Maria, that's over to me. I've got a number of people who want to ask questions. What I would like to suggest is, whilst we have them in the Q&A menu and I can see them, it may not be that Maria can. So I was going to ask if people would like to ask their questions directly. I know that Andrew Carpenter has a couple of questions, so I'll ask Andrew to start it off. I have Jose Hernandez, Richard Whitaker, Michael Craggs, Chris Speakman and Paul Chatwin all want to ask questions. So if they'd like to raise their hand, I will open it up so you can ask your question directly. So over to you, Andrew, and I'll open the other people as we go along. Thanks.
Thanks, Howard. Maria, first of all, thank you for a splendid presentation. Really, really good. We can all take something away from that, and I think it will now stimulate a good session in terms of Q&A. You've really covered one of my questions already, because there's this dilemma about the use of public transport. We know that the climate crisis is suggesting that we should use public transport wherever and whenever we can, and yet the current government advice, because of COVID-19, is that we shouldn't use public transport. How do you think that's going to affect confidence going forward?
Yeah, I think it's a big issue and a key concern. I think there's a risk that the kind of heightened awareness of germs and diseases, you know, even things as simple as coughs and colds spreading when you're in close proximity to people, could impact on people's views around public transport and how they travel in the future. I do worry about the number of retailers who are operating on a drive-through or a drive and collect basis at the moment, and that encouraging or necessitating car use. I think in the longer term, obviously we're continuing to invest in our public transport network. We're seeing construction of metro continuing on site even throughout the COVID-19 lockdown. So I think longer term, we just need to be positioned to, at the right time, send out those messages that public transport is the way to travel and it is what's necessary in terms of tackling the climate emergency. But I think coupled with the other measures around clean air zone being introduced in the city and changes to availability and cost of parking, that it will be a carrot and stick approach to retarget that modal shift again when the time's right.
It'll be about winning hearts and minds again, really, won't it? Because from a personal point of view, I've sort of made a decision when we do get out of lockdown that when I go to London, for example, I think it's highly unlikely I'm going to use the tube again, certainly for a while. So I think it's about winning hearts and minds. My other question was around your building strategy for the council going forward. When it comes to new build, will you be insisting on designers, specifiers, contractors using building materials with low embodied carbon figures? Will that be a consideration?
Do you mean for our own stock that we can?
Yes, those that you could influence, either directly or indirectly.
Yeah, so
like they've done in France, for example, at the moment, where the French government have said that from next year, 50% of all public buildings should be built in structural timber because of the low embodied carbon figures. Is that the sort of direction of travel you think you might consider?
I think it's probably too early to say definitely, but there's certainly a review of the Municipal Housing Trust specification to look at how we can demand lower carbon emissions and more environmentally friendly buildings. So I think pilot projects there could influence other public sector buildings as well going forward.
Well, if you need any help, Maria, you know where to come.
Thank you.
I'll let others now ask questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. I've got one question. I'll try and keep them in the order, but I'll bring people in. But I've got two questions that come from Jose Hernandez. He didn't put his hand up. So, first question he asked is, what were the outcomes of the housing workshop, and especially in relation to developing a large program of deep retrofitting in the domestic sector? Are you looking at schemes? Oh, he's come up. I tell you what, I'll bring him straight in. Let's have a. Jose, I'm just going to open you up, promoting you to panelists. So if you open your microphone, if you want to open your camera, that's fine. Carry on. Over to you, Jose. Open your microphone at least. Yep, you can now speak.
Only that I can no longer see the text of the question I put, but basically it was in relation to the workshops that you had on housing, and what were the outcomes, especially in relation to the existing housing stock. You mentioned the future home standards, and that will address some of those aspects, but there is a need for a deep retrofit, large-scale, mass-scale program that would also help with the green economic recovery, not only because of the impact on reduction of carbon emissions, but on employment as well. And any thoughts on how that program could be funded?
Yeah, I think in terms of the housing workshop, it was identified that essentially there are three main categories of residential buildings to retrofit. So there's the stock that we control, which in some respects is easier, but obviously there's a big funding issue there. Then there are private owner-occupied residential dwellings. That is very difficult to force, but I think a programme of information around making it easier for people to make the right choice where they want to make those choices is certainly something that we would look at in the short term. And then there's the more difficult private rented sector, because that's where there are issues around landlords not being incentivised to invest in their stock in the same way, because any savings on energy bills will be felt by the tenant, not the actual owner. So I think some sort of tighter regulations from government would probably be needed in order to address that sector. In terms of what we're actually doing, I think at the moment we're kind of open to suggestions. We're looking at different best practice examples and trying to work out the strategy for retrofitting.
Yeah, thank you. And the other question was in relation to what platforms are you using to share knowledge, strategies, and progress with other local authorities?
We've got information publicly available on our website. So all of the information relating to the task force and video recordings of the task force meetings are available on our website. So that's in the public domain. In terms of other local authorities, we're obviously working closely with Combined Authority, who have their own ambition to be net zero carbon by 2041. And as part of that, there's a Combined Authority working group where we're working with our neighbours.
Thank you.
Are you happy with that, Jose? I'll move on. Richard's got a question, Richard Whitaker. I've opened your ability to speak either by microphone or by camera, so please ask your questions.
Good afternoon. It was in relation to where Maria talked about construction standards, and I was just going to ask what EPC rating will be targeted and what sort of timescale are you looking at to achieve it?
Again, this is something that's quite uncertain. So the government's Future Homes Standard consultation set out a possible pathway nationally, but that wouldn't allow us to be net zero by 2030. So we're awaiting the outcome of that, and then we're also considering whether it's the right thing to update our local planning policies to try and further progress energy efficiency standards in new buildings. But yeah, at the moment, again, the work's not being done to say for definite where we'll be, but we hope to take forward either a policy locally or to have an outcome on the Future Home Standard.
Thank you. I would promote a local policy that gets us higher to the minimum building regs sort of standards. That would be really helpful and support us in introducing it in across all our working area. So I would look forward to that. Thank you.
That's the challenge for us, because if the government take one approach on the Future Home Standard, then they intend to remove the ability of local authorities to set local policies. So that's why we need to wait for the outcome of that national standard.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Richard. I think I have a question from Chris Speakman, but unless he comes on and says, I think it's actually just been answered. So I'll move on to Paul Chatwin. Paul, you've got your microphone and everything's over to you. There you go.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Maria. Just before I ask the question, Richard's point now on EPCs. EPCs and building regs are not the best method for zero carbon. They're just a compliance tool. and they use old emissions factors, yes, we should be pushing good EPCs, but we need a proper real energy kind of metric to get to the zero carbon future. My question was CHP. I'm a bit on the fence with CHP. You mentioned in the presentation, and this is a bit of an unfair question, Maria, because it's a bit techie, but whatever the future is, you're committed to the CHP until 2031. There needs to be renewably fueled in order to be zero carbon. It's kind of got a bit of a bad press, CHP, and that may be a bit unfair in certain respects. So I don't want to start condemning anything because we need to look at everything. But if we can get the system operating at a low temperature, if we can get the system with a lower emission factor, that would be a good future. So the question is going to be, is there any plans to actually enhance that system to be more efficient in operation?
Yeah, and I think, without meaning to sound like a cop-out again, it's another one where we are aware of the issue, and we are looking at, you know, what we would need to do in order to decarbonise that in some way and what the options might be. But at the moment, there aren't any kind of decisions or proposals for it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I've got a question from Michael Craggs. I've opened your ability to ask that live, so over to you.
Yeah, hi Maria, Mike Craggs. Just wanted to ask a question going back to your transport in Birmingham City, and just regarding the ULEZ restrictions, and if you're going to be applying any costs, if you're going to let high emission vehicles still access the city centre. And I've got particular interest because, you know, a lot of organisations like housing associations are looking to renew fleet. And one of the things that we're finding a difficulty is the implementation of EV charging. So a bit of a two-pronged question. So will you be restricting vehicles going into the city? And if you are, will you be charging something similar to the Bristol approach? And a second part is, will you be incentivising electric vehicles by supplying enough EV charging?
Yeah, so I guess two answers really. Firstly, the Clean Air Zone proposal has been delayed. We're now expecting it to go live in January. It was delayed pre-COVID due to technical problems, and then obviously COVID has delayed it further. So that Clean Air Zone essentially charges the highest polluting vehicles for entering the city. And off the top of my head, I think it's £8 a day for cars and £50 a day for heavy goods vehicles. But if vehicles are compliant, then they don't pay. So that's Euro 6.2 standard. It's the same as the London ultra low emission zone, or the London low emission zone restrictions. So there will be an element of incentivising people to switch to cleaner vehicles, but coupled with that, there are proposals to increase accessibility to electric vehicle charging points across the city centre. So that should be coming on stream next year as well, looking at where electric vehicle charging points are positioned and also the duration of stay. So restricting how long people can stay there, so it's more of a charge and go service rather than a park up for the day type arrangement. So that should increase the number of vehicles that can be charged throughout the day.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. I've actually got 8 more questions here, 2 of which are anonymous. But before I ask the anonymous ones, I'm going to ask if Rebecca Lydon, Sarah Lee, Stephen Kirk, Patrick Hannay, Paul Schlinger and Lucy Hoggins want to ask their questions live. If they do, please put your hands up and then I can open up your ability to do that. But Maria, I've got a question that's anonymous here. It says, Birmingham City Council has a stock of circa 64,000 houses, many with gas heating, traditional construction. Whilst new construction can achieve carbon targets, are there plans for the many existing homes?
Yes, so in terms of the current public sector housing stock, we are obviously aware of the need to retrofit, and we are looking at proposals for that. We're looking at how we could secure funding and how we take that forward. But yeah, it's very much on the radar.
Okay, thanks very much on that. I've got two people who've come live now, Patrick Hannay and Paul Slinger. So if Patrick, you'd like to ask your question.
Hi. I'm actually from live in Monmouthshire County Council, and we're going through a similar process with Monmouthshire. I'm a member of Extinction Rebellion in Abergavenny Transition Town, and my question, and it's the one we're putting to Monmouthshire, and I know it's a very different context because you've got huge public assets and you've got huge housing stock which you can control, and therefore you have a lot of assets and you can make an impact. But my question always is to all these councils. Well, let's take Monmouthshire as an example. Actual carbon footprint is probably about 2% of Monmouthshire's carbon footprint. But while it's very responsible at tackling all their assets, we're always asking, will you put a lot of funds into facilitating and enabling intense street level, community level discussions about how people are going to adapt to climate change and what they need to do, and try and put an enormous amount of effort to have those discussions. And the tendency is they want to avoid all that. And when we keep talking to them about having more citizens' assemblies and having more conversations, is Birmingham going to do more engagement? Because you've had your survey, are you going to actually do an enormous amount more about that? Because what we need to do is actually bring everybody on board, and dealing with your own assets may be only a tiny part of the problem.
Yes, we have, as a subgroup of the task force, a communications and engagement working group. So the survey and the first round of focus groups have taken place. On top of that, there are plans to keep communities engaged as we move forward, and some of the work from the survey included thinking about how we can best engage communities going forward. And we have, on the task force, we have community representatives as well, and Youth Strike for Climate, so those voices are being heard at the task force. But yeah, I'm conscious that community engagement needs to continue throughout the process, and we need to get communities to buy in and to recognise their responsibilities.
Could I suggest that one of the things that's fascinating about the effect of COVID is that now, certainly across where I live, which is Abergavenny, we've got a huge number of WhatsApp street groups, and they are potentially a fantastic new sort of rising up of everybody in the streets engaged in the group. And those are maybe potentially terrific mechanisms to get conversations going at a very low level. So just think we need to use lots more than just community reps on a committee. Need to engage, and it requires resources to facilitate it. It's enough from me.
Okay, thank you, Patrick. I've got a question here to keep in strict order from Rebecca Lydon. So Maria, she asked, will there be an opportunity for wider inputs to the action plan from those not on the task force?
I guess at the moment, not directly. We've had conversations with people who've approached us. So, you know, we're happy to talk to people who are kind of coming forward and approaching us. But in terms of the actual detail of the action plan, there isn't any direct community engagement on that. I think when we move to having those recommendations in place and getting a strategy for implementing them, then that's where we'll see more of the community engagement coming in.
Thanks, Maria. I hope that answers Rebecca's question. If not, please come back, Rebecca. Sarah Lee, I think you've now got the ability to ask this question directly, so please open up your mic and camera.
I won't open up my camera if that's okay, but I just...
That's fine, absolutely no problem.
I'm in the kitchen.
Oh.
I just wanted to say thank you for this talk. I actually work in and live in Plymouth, and I'm chairing the Plymouth branch of the RIBA at the moment, and we're heading up a sort of similar project with Plymouth City Council, but we're also trying to engage the local university, who obviously have enormous amounts of research and knowledge in different areas that can help to influence sort of how we tackle this climate emergency. And we're trying to set up a sort of conference, although it's probably going to end up being virtual now because of the COVID-19 situation. And I put in my question, obviously, about really construction and how we can try and raise construction levels, because although people talk about building regulations and planning system that we have, it seems to me that they're the only tools we have to make sure that any new buildings are actually improved in the way that they perform in their energy levels. So I just wondered if you have any plans to try and implement those in maybe planning policy using, say, zero carbon or passive house or BREEAM in those sort of conditions.
Yeah, I think that's not dissimilar to a question that we touched on earlier, and also one from an anonymous attendee that's a bit further down the list. But in terms of addressing that point, the difficulty that we have at the moment is, firstly, the policy in the Birmingham Development Plan was designed to be a more stringent requirement, and the planning inspector didn't feel that we could justify what we were asking for. So at the time that the Birmingham Development Plan went through examination, the policy was redrafted to not require such high standards as the City Council originally hoped they could get in place. In terms of moving forward, one of the things that we could do is review our local planning policies, but it comes back to this point of being certain of what we can do and awaiting the outcome of the Future Homes consultation that government had last year. Because if they take one of their proposed avenues, then that would block off the ability for us it would remove the legislation that allows us to set more stringent policies locally. So at the moment, it's one of the issues that we're working through, how best to try and push up those standards.
Can I just say one other thing? We're working with Exeter City Council quite a lot as well, and it seems that they're really trying to lead by example in the way that they're using passive house standards for any of their new buildings, and they're currently constructing, I think, the first passive house leisure centre in, I don't know if it's the world or Europe, but it's quite impressive how they're, as you said, leading by example. It seems like a great opportunity.
Yeah, so part of the work around the Birmingham Municipal Housing Trust exemplar projects and looking at what we can do with our own built stock is designed to improve the quality of what we're delivering, but also try and kind of provide that inspiration locally and demonstrate how it can be done. In terms of the Exeter example, I know that my colleague who's leading on the Municipal Housing Trust work has been in discussions with Exeter, so we are looking at what they're doing and how they're achieving that. Great,
thanks very much.
Thanks very much. I have a question from Stephen Kirk. How were antitheses procured? What procurement vehicle was used, and how would future consultancy support be procured?
In terms of antithesis, I'm not sure, because they had been appointed when I arrived, so I haven't actually looked into that. In terms of moving forward, there's no kind of firm commitment at the moment to what sort of consultancy support that we would need, but we would be obviously governed by our internal procurement processes. So generally local authority procurements have to go out for a set number of days through the local authority procurement system that I can't remember the name of, but they're all advertised in one place.
Okay. I've got another question here that is anonymous. I've got a question from Paul Slinger. I've opened your microphone so you can speak, Paul. It's a very brief question, so just please ask your question.
Yeah, hi Maria. Thanks very much for that talk. It was purely you'd mentioned in response to an earlier question that the minutes and so on of the workshops were available. Is there a particular web address or something that we can search that gives us access to all
Yes.
of these documents that spoke off from this, including policies and all the different elements and where it's all going?
Yeah, in terms of our Route to Zero task force webpage, what I can do is if I send the link to Howard, perhaps are you able to circulate it to people attending?
Yep, or they can actually get it off the website once, if you send it to us, they'll be able to get a copy of your presentation as well and even listen to this again. So that's leadersmeets.com.
Okay, I'll send it over to Howard after the presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a question from Lucy, and then I've got one more that's anonymous. So Lucy, would you like to ask your question directly?
Yes. Can you
Thank
hear me?
you. Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Hi, Maria. Thanks for the presentation. My question was around the scope of emissions for the city. So in the first slide, you stated that you're considering scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions to become net zero across the city. I mean, that's really ambitious, the scope 3 particularly. Have you got a methodology for measuring scope 3, and have you got ideas on how you might tackle that big chunk?
I think it's too early to say at the moment in terms of how we would tackle it.
Okay, is that going to form part of the route map that's being prepared?
Yes, so the route will set out kind of the everyone recommend of we think we need to put in place. And obviously, they're subject to endorsement, and once they've been endorsed by council, we'll look at taking those forward for delivery.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Thanks very much. I've got a couple more questions. One is anonymous. The other is from Rob Lamb. If Rob would like to ask his questions, if he wants to do that live, please put his hand up and I'll open his screen in a minute. The first one is anonymous. It's a thank you, firstly. Then a bit of a statement. Birmingham local plan was adopted in 2017 prior to the climate emergency declaration. Do you require higher sustainability standards for new buildings than the LP policies set out following the declaration? That's the first question. Would you like to answer that one first, Maria? Then I'll go on to the second part of it.
Yeah, I can actually see the question on the screen.
Oh, fine. Okay, carry on then.
In terms of the, this is the question that I partially addressed earlier. In terms of requiring higher than local plan policies, we have no policy basis for requiring higher levels, but we will certainly work with developers where they are willing to go further, to go over and above what's required in the local plan. So we have seen examples of, developers coming forward with things that go beyond the local plan requirements. We're obviously more than supportive of that. In terms of the material consideration, it doesn't override the local plan requirements, so it comes back to that not having a policy basis to require, for example, all buildings at the moment to be net zero carbon.
Fine. I've got a question, last one at the moment, from Rob Lamb. I'll ask it. It says, given the declared climate emergency, is there sufficient urgency in progressing with implementation of actions to achieve the carbon neutral by 2030 target?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. 2030 is 9.5 years away, and there's obviously a lot of work to do. I think the target is very ambitious, and we obviously need to be mindful of this transition element, the impacts of COVID, and not further exacerbating those impacts. I think there are lots of opportunities in terms of green recovery, but yeah, I guess whilst we feel that we're doing as much as we can to move things forward, there does remain a question mark over whether 2030 is achievable in terms of net zero. But I think it's better to have an ambitious target than to kind of move away from the target without an evidence base.
Thank you very much. We don't seem to have any more questions, so conveniently we're almost up to time. So I'm going to ask Andrew just to close events. So over to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Howard. First of all, Maria, a big thank you to you. A really insightful, useful, and if I may say enjoyable last hour spent with you, listening to what Birmingham City Council are proposing on their move to addressing the climate crisis. And I'm sure we've all taken away snippets of information that we can take back into our own businesses. So Maria, thank you for that. We continue our run of webinars next week, and two really big important subject matters to consider. On Tuesday we have Simon Rawlinson from Arcadis, but also from the Construction Leadership Council, and we will be looking at the roadmap to recovery on what a post-COVID-19 construction industry could and should look like. And then on Friday we have Anna Clark from the Construction Products Association, who will be dealing with the really important topic of quality, and we'll be looking at post-Grenfell, post-Hackett, and how that is implementing our thoughts and actions in the UK construction industry. So that's coming up next week, post-COVID on Tuesday and quality on Friday. Without further ado, I'm going to thank Howard, I'm going to thank John, our hosts, and once again I'm going to thank Maria. I'm going to wish all of you a very good afternoon and a very pleasant weekend. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye now.
Thank you.